They say our official history begins with broken statues, ruined temples, and fragments of clay tablets. But there is another timeline buried beneath those ruins, one that does not appear in any official chronicle. In that hidden timeline, Earth was never truly free. It was a worksite. From the darkness beyond the known planets, a wandering world traced a long and dangerous path. Nibiru. From that world came the Anunnaki, towering beings with lifespans that stretched over millennia, masters of genetics, metallurgy, and gravitational technology. To the first humans, they were gods. To themselves, they were simply the rightful rulers of a young and resource-rich planet they called a project, Earth. Their need was very specific: gold. On Nibiru, gold was not a symbol of wealth. It was survival. Pulverized, vaporized, and suspended in the upper atmosphere, it could stabilize their damaged world. That urgency justified colossal operations. They built landing platforms, orbital stations, and vast mining complexes across the surface of Earth. At first, the lower ranks of Anunnaki were forced into the mines, under the command of royal bloodlines and scientific elites. But resentment grew. Why should the children of Nibiru dig like animals on a primitive world? The answer came from the laboratories. In hidden facilities buried beneath the stone of early cities, Anunnaki geneticists took a primitive hominid and rewrote it. DNA became a programmable language in their hands. They spliced, rearranged, and tested. Failed prototypes died in silence. Others survived only to be dissected and analyzed. Eventually, a design emerged that satisfied both scientists and rulers. They created humanity, not in a single miraculous moment, but in iterations. Muscles strengthened, bones reinforced, immune systems tuned to dust, heat, and exhaustion. Brains calibrated to be smart enough to understand orders, but, in theory, not quite wise enough to question their own existence. The first humans woke into chains. They rose with the first light and marched to the mines. They carried stone, or tools and equipment along straight roads that led to towering ziggurats. From those structures, bright ships descended with a low, vibrating hum, offloading Anunnaki overseers who watched from platforms above. Human workers slept in long barracks along canals and reservoirs. Their lives were measured in work cycles, punishments, injuries, and rare moments of rest. Most of them never saw beyond the mines, the fields, and the walls of the cities they built but did not own. Names faded. Numbers replaced them, but not entirely. In one of those complexes, a network of mines that burrowed deep into the bones of the earth, there was a young human slave who had once been born with a name. That name was stripped away when he was branded and cataloged. Among the other slaves, he became known only as the Dreamer. He earned that title because, while most collapsed into unconsciousness at the end of each crushing shift, he often woke in the middle of the night cycle, trembling, his chest tight, his eyes wet. He saw things in his sleep no one else saw. He dreamed of a sky that was not Earth's. 3 suns shone above an alien horizon, casting multiple, overlapping shadows. The air shimmered with metallic clouds. Towering structures, almost translucent, rose into a violet sky. Tall figures moved through wide halls of light, speaking in tones he did not understand but somehow felt familiar with. He could smell the air of that world. He could feel the weight of its gravity. He could hear the hum of its machines. He did not know the name Nibiru, but night after night his mind returned there. During the day, while others focused only on surviving, he sometimes paused for a second too long, looking up through the dust at the distant sky. He would watch the bright ships of the Anunnaki moving silently from one platform to another and feel a strange pull inside his chest, a feeling of recognition and displacement, as if part of him belonged somewhere else. Curiosity in a slave was not a virtue. It was a flaw. Supervisors noticed the way he sometimes stared too long, the way he seemed more aware than he should be. Whips fell harder on his back. Orders barked at him were sharper than those given to others. But the questions inside him did not die. Why do I see places I have never walked? Why do I feel that this is not the only sky I have known? His fate changed on a day that began like any other. Heat pressed down on the surface as workers were driven toward the mine entrances. The dreamer's muscles burned from previous shifts, but his body moved out of habit. He carried tools and hauling gear into the darkness. Hours blurred together in the rhythm of strikes, lifts, and the dull echoes of metal against stone. Then, as the shift ended and slaves were forced back toward the exit tunnel, a group of Anunnaki guards waited at the mouth of the mine. Their armor glimmered faintly under the artificial lights. One of them held a projection tablet, lines of symbols flickering in the air above it. The guard began to call out designations, not names. Slaves stepped aside, pulled from the line, confused and afraid. When the code corresponding to the dreamer's brand was spoken, a hand seized his arm. Heavy restraints closed around his wrists. Another device, a collar that gave off a low, continuous hum, was locked around his neck. He had seen such collars before. Those who wore them did not return to the barracks. He was dragged away from the others, down a service corridor sloping deeper into the earth. The air grew cooler, cleaner, saturated with a metallic scent. The rough walls gave way to smooth surfaces that reflected light without showing a clear reflection, like polished stone fused with metal. The noise of the mines faded. A new sound replaced it, the steady pulse of machines running without rest. The corridor opened into an elevator shaft. The floor beneath him vibrated gently as the platform descended. Lights flickered past. When it stopped and the doors slid open, the dreamer stepped into a world no ordinary slave was meant to see. He had entered the heart of an Anunnaki underground base. Here, architecture served not worship but science. Long hallways extended in straight lines, their ceilings lined with soft bands of white light that never flickered. Transparent panels revealed laboratories filled with tanks of shimmering liquid, where human bodies drifted in silent suspension. In other chambers, consoles projected shifting fields of data into the air, symbols rewriting themselves in real time. Some humans returned from this place changed. Their eyes became empty, their movements stiff and mechanical. They obeyed with unnatural precision, never hesitating, never questioning. Slaves whispered that such people had lost their souls. The Anunnaki had another term, reprogrammed assets. Others never returned at all. The dreamer was guided into a circular chamber, its walls layered with invisible technology. In the center stood a platform that glowed faintly with blue light. Guards pushed him onto it. As soon as his feet touched the surface, a tingling sensation rose from his legs to his spine, as though his entire body were being scanned from the inside out. Columns of light emerged around him, forming an invisible cage. Symbols appeared in the air, measurements of bone density, blood chemistry, neural activity. To him, they were meaningless. To the Anunnaki scientists who monitored them, they were everything. And then she entered. She did not announce herself. She didn't need to. The guards straightened instinctively. She was tall even for an Anunnaki. Her skin held a faint golden undertone, as if lit from within. Her eyes were striking, a deep, shifting color somewhere between amber and blue, ancient and sharp. Her clothing, a fitted garment marked with precise geometric symbols, identified her as part of the scientific elite and as a member of a noble lineage. Her name among the Anunnaki was Sail-2. He would later know her only as Sail. She approached the platform with measured steps, her attention fixed on the data projected into the air. Her pupils adjusted minutely to the information streaming before her, assisted by internal implants. She spoke quietly to the system, and new layers of analysis appeared. For several moments, she behaved like every other Anunnaki scientist. Clinical, detached, focused entirely on the numbers, the patterns, the anomalies. Then she lifted her gaze. Her eyes met his. This moment should have meant nothing. A god looking at a slave, a creator regarding a tool. But what she saw in his face was not the usual blend of terror and numbness. There was fear, yes. There was pain. But there was also something else. There was awareness. There were unspoken questions. There was a mind pushing against invisible walls. Sale glanced at the data again. Something about his readings did not match the standard models. Neural patterns were more complex. Emotional responses were unusually strong. And there, but buried in the diagnostics was something else. Unique resonance patterns associated with memory fragments that did not belong to his life on Earth. She requested a deeper scan. The chamber dimmed. Arcs of faint light converged around the dreamer's head. He felt a pressure behind his eyes. Images rose up inside his mind, forced from the depths where his dreams usually hid them. 3 suns over a violet horizon, translucent towers, metallic clouds, hallways of living light. Sale watched those images as projections, and her composure shifted almost imperceptibly. These were not random hallucinations. She recognized those landscapes. They were regions of Nibiru. No human slave should see those places. No human should know them with such clarity. Somewhere along the line, someone had pushed the genetic experiment too far, or something had slipped out of control. This human did not only carry mixed DNA. He carried echoes of Anunnaki memory. Sale dismissed the guards with a subtle gesture that, to them, signaled routine procedure. They stepped back but remained at the perimeter. She stepped closer to the platform, her eyes scanning both the data and his expression. For a brief instant, he stopped trying to be invisible. The dreamer studied her face, the severity of her features, the intensity in her eyes, and, for reasons he did not understand, felt less like an animal awaiting slaughter and more like something being recognized. He did not know the language of the Anunnaki. She did not speak his crude tongue. And yet, something unspoken passed between them in that silent gaze. From that day forward, his life in the mines was over. His life under Sale's observation had begun. He was relocated to a special classification, a subject of ongoing experimentation. Instead of descending into the mines each cycle, he was brought to the underground base. There, he was strapped into strange chairs, surrounded by arcs of crystal that glowed with energy. Machines measured his thoughts as stimuli flooded his senses. Sometimes, he was placed in suspension fields that altered his perception of time. Other times, he was exposed to controlled stress, fear, or pain, while his brain responses were recorded in cold detail. Sale watched everything. She watched how quickly he recovered from physical strain. She watched how his vital signs changed when certain symbols, sounds, or images were presented. She watched how his neural activity spiked when visions of Nibiru were triggered. When his dreams appeared on the monitors, she felt a quiet unease. He was not just reacting to artificial images. He was remembering something stored deep within his genetic code. In a private log, she noted, "We have crossed a limit without admitting it. This subject suggests that human design is no longer entirely under our control. We have imprinted too much of ourselves." According to Anunnaki doctrine, that realization should have led her to recommend immediate reclassification, erasure, or full reprogramming. But she did not. Instead, she requested more time. Over many sessions, something unusual began to happen. Moments between procedures, seconds that should have meant nothing, became windows for silent observation. He would glance at her and hold her gaze. She would pause longer than protocol required before authorizing the next sequence. She began to notice details no one else cared about. The way his hands tensed before each scan, the way his breathing changed when the images of Nibiru appeared, the way his eyes filled with a complex mix of awe and grief when he saw the alien sky. And then, one day, the barrier between observer and observed cracked. During a particularly demanding session, the machines forced a stronger stream of memories and visions through his mind. His body trembled. Sweat ran down his temples. The restraints held him upright, but his legs weakened. When the procedure ended and the arcs retracted, the guards stepped away for a moment to check the recorded data. The dreamer tried to stand and almost collapsed. Before the guards could intervene, Sale moved. She reached forward and caught his arm, her hand wrapped around his skin. A simple act, meant only to keep him from falling. But in that contact, both of them felt something unexpected. He felt a warmth and a resonance that triggered another wave of vision. The corridors of Nibiru, the sensation of walking with certainty, the weight of authority. Not as an observer, but as if he had once stood in those halls himself. She felt, through the subtle biological sensors embedded in her fingertips, the full intensity of his emotional state. Fear, exhaustion, confusion, and something else. A strong, stubborn will to remain himself in spite of everything done to him. It was a single moment, but it was enough. She steadied him and withdrew her hand. The guards returned, unaware of the significance of what had just transpired. The session was logged as routine. From that point, Sale's decisions began to shift. She blocked certain proposals from other scientists who wanted to test invasive procedures on him. She quietly modified his profile in the system, marking him as high-value neurogenetic asset, a label that required additional approvals before any irreversible alterations could be made. In her private reflections, a dangerous question formed. At what point does a created being become more than a tool? The dreamer noticed the difference before he understood it. His treatments remained harsh, but some of the worst experiments never reached him. Needles stopped at the edge of his skin. Commands were canceled at the last moment. When pain grew too intense, she would sometimes end a procedure earlier than necessary. In the stillness between torments, their eyes met more often. And though they still could not speak the same verbal language, the space between them filled with a different kind of communication. Curiosity, doubt, recognition. One night cycle, when the base was quieter than usual and many systems were running in reduced energy mode, Sale made a choice that would change both their lives. She ordered the dreamer to be relocated under her direct supervision for extended cognitive testing. The guards obeyed, seeing nothing unusual. She was a scientist of high rank. Instead of taking him to the usual chamber, she led him down an unfamiliar corridor, past a series of security gates. They entered a large, dim space whose ceiling was made of transparent material. Beyond it, the sky of Earth stretched wide and dark. Stars burned like quiet witnesses. High above, distant Anunnaki craft traced thin lines of light as they moved in orbital lanes. The dreamer froze. He had seen the sky before, but never like this. In the mines and barracks, it was always filtered by dust, smoke, and the weight of exhaustion. Here, from deep underground, a shaft opened directly to the heavens, protected by invisible fields. For the first time in his life, he saw the stars unobstructed. Sale walked to the center of the chamber and gestured for him to follow. He did, slowly, his eyes locked on the distant, glowing points. "Look there," she said, speaking softly in her own language, knowing her implants would translate the intent, if not the exact words, into impressions his mind could feel. She pointed toward a faint, almost unnoticeable light, different from the fixed stars, marked on her internal displays as a targeted coordinate. "That is where I come from. That is Nibiru." He did not understand the name, but he felt its weight. A pressure grew in his chest, and tears slid down his face without his permission. The sight of that tiny, distant light ignited a storm inside him. Images surged. Alien skies, foreign cities, the hum of a world that felt both wrong and deeply familiar. "Why do I know that place?" he whispered in his own tongue, the words rough and quiet. "Why do I feel as if I have walked there?" To his surprise, the answer came. "Because we put too much of ourselves inside you," she thought. "Because our arrogance refused to see the cost." Out loud, in a calm, measured tone, she said, "Part of what you are was made from us. Part of what you see belongs to a world that is not yours, and yet lives in you." He did not understand every nuance, but he felt the truth behind her voice. In that moment, in that chamber, their roles shifted again. He was no longer just a subject, and she was no longer just an untouchable deity. They stood together beneath the same sky, connected by distance, memory, and a genetic bridge that should never have existed. What neither of them could ignore any longer was the forbidden truth forming quietly between them. A growing bond, rooted in curiosity, compassion, and something that approached affection. A slave designed to obey, a scientist raised to control, both trapped in a system that did not allow either of them to feel what they were beginning to feel. And now, as we follow this trail of secrets and forbidden connections, there is a question that turns directly to you, listening to this investigation. What do you think about what you have heard so far? Could a being engineered for obedience truly develop genuine emotion? Could a member of the Anunnaki, raised to see humans as tools, cross the line into empathy or even love? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective is a vital part of this ongoing investigation. Time continued to pass, measured not by human years but by cycles of experiments and reports. The relationship between Sale and the dreamer deepened in small, almost invisible increments. She began to test more than his physiology. She tested his choices. In controlled environments, she presented him with moral dilemmas disguised as simple tasks. Which prisoner to help when only one could be saved? Whether to eat while another starved? Whether to obey an order that would harm someone else or face punishment himself? He consistently made choices that prioritized others, even at personal cost. She recorded these results with growing unease. Human slaves, in theory, were supposed to be self-preserving within narrow limits. His behavior suggested something else: the emergence of complex ethical reasoning, sacrifice, and a capacity for deep attachment. In quiet moments, away from the monitors, she found herself lingering by his containment cell. The transparent barrier pulsed faintly with energy, a constant reminder that contact between them was forbidden. "You dream even when you are awake," she said once, more to herself than to him. He watched her lips move, not understanding the words but sensing the tone. He stepped closer to the barrier. "When I close my eyes," he said softly, "I see your sky. When I open them, I see you. I do not know what that means." The translator inside her conveyed the essence of his statement. For the first time in her long life, Sale felt something she could not easily categorize within the framework of Anunnaki rationality. On Nibiru, relationships were structured by status, bloodline, and political calculation. Bonds were contracts. Affection was controlled, managed, and often suppressed. What she felt now did not fit those structures. It felt like a vulnerability, felt like a risk. Beyond the walls of the underground base, forces were stirring. In high orbit above Earth, within a massive command station, Anunnaki authorities debated the future of the entire project. Some argued that the mining operations should continue indefinitely, supported by an ever-evolving slave population. Others, alarmed by reports of genetic drift, slave resistance, and unplanned mutations, pushed for a reset, a calculated planetary disaster that would wipe out large portions of the human population, followed by the seeding of a more controlled version. Scientific data became political ammunition, and among that data was the file of Sale's subject, the dreamer. His case appeared in remote councils as an example of unacceptable deviation. A human slave with complex emotional responses, partial access to Anunnaki memories, and a measurable capacity for independent moral reasoning. All of this was seen by some as a fatal flaw in the human design. Assets must not imagine themselves as anything more than assets. One high-ranking official declared in a session recorded in fragmented form in later copies. This subject represents the erosion of that principle. Orders were given. The dreamer's profile was flagged for possible reclassification into a more extreme program. Full memory rewrite, emotional suppression, or complete disassembly for genetic study. Sale received the directive in her private console. On the surface, she acknowledged it with the expected neutrality. Inside, something broke. She had spent countless cycles studying this human. She had watched him suffer, endure, and still show concern for others. She had seen the way he looked at her not with blind worship, but with a searching, almost equal gaze. In a way she could barely admit to herself, she had come to care about his existence. The order demanded that she help erase everything that made him unique. That night cycle, she stood alone in the observatory chamber where she had once shown him the sky. Through the transparent ceiling, the stars looked colder. She knew that if she directly disobeyed, her own status would be questioned. Scientists, even of noble lineage, were not above punishment. Yet she also knew that obeying meant turning her back on everything she had learned from this forbidden experiment. Not just about him, but about her own species and the consequences of their arrogance. Meanwhile, the dreamer sensed that something had changed. The guards around him became more tense. The procedures grew more invasive. He overheard fragments of speech he could not fully understand, but intuition filled the gaps. He knew he was in danger. More than once, he saw other subjects being led down corridors from which no one returned. Some of them had once shared the barracks with him. Others were empty-eyed clones, nearly identical faces marching in silent columns toward unknown fates. The underground base held secret wings where entire armies of human replicas were being grown, conditioned, and stored. These were not workers but weapons. Their minds had been stripped nearly bare and rebuilt with a narrow, violent focus. They would obey any command given by the Anunnaki commanders without hesitation, even if it meant walking into certain death. These zombie clones, as later witnesses would call them in modern abduction narratives, were part of a contingency plan. If human populations on the surface became too unstable, these controlled soldiers would be unleashed. The dreamer saw them only briefly, but the sight never left him. Rows of identical bodies, eyes open yet unseeing, breathing in perfect synchronization. He recognized with horror that the same technology could be used on him. One cycle, as he was being moved between chambers, alarms briefly echoed through the base. Lights flickered. A tremor ran through the floor. Somewhere far above, a controlled detonation had misfired, causing unexpected damage on the surface. In the confusion, a solitary guard was left with him in a holding corridor. The guard seemed distracted, glancing nervously at a communication device on his wrist. The dreamer sensed an opportunity he did not fully understand. "You are afraid," he said quietly, in his own language, looking straight at the armored figure. The Anunnaki could not understand the words, but something in the human's tone, steady, observant, almost calm, made him look again. Behind the human's eyes, he saw not mindless panic, but awareness. For an Anunnaki, being observed, truly observed, by a slave was deeply unsettling. Later, the guard reported that moment to his superior, and the report reached Sale. "He should not speak like that," the superior said. "Not about us. Remove whatever in him allows that." Sale knew the clock was running out. Before the most extreme measures could be implemented, she made a decision that crossed the last line she had left. She entered his containment cell when no one expected it. Protocol dictated that the barrier remain in place at all times, with commands issued from outside. On that cycle, she shut it down. The air shimmered as the energy field dissolved. The dreamer felt the change immediately. He looked up and saw her step through the threshold into the same space he occupied. For the first time, there was no barrier between them, no transparent wall, no field of humming light, just two beings in the same confined room. He stood slowly, uncertain. Every survival instinct screamed that this was a test, a trap, a final experiment. She was close enough now that he could see the fine details of her face, the faint lines of age that no rejuvenation technology could fully erase, the tiny motions of her eyes as she studied him, the subtle tension in her jaw. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. There was nothing in any manual to guide this. Finally, she stepped closer. "You should not exist as you are," she said in her language, the translation implant echoing the meaning into his mind as a wave of impression rather than a string of words. "They will destroy you or hollow you out if I obey." He swallowed. His throat was dry. "Will you obey?" he asked, the question simple but the meaning immense. Sale felt the weight of all her years on Nibiru, all her training, all her loyalty to the structures that had shaped her. She saw, at the same time, the long chain of human suffering engineered by her own kind. Generations born into chains, bodies consumed by labor, minds stunted by design. "I do not know what I will do," she said honestly. "For the first time, I do not know." In that confession, something irreversible crystallized. This was no longer a controlled observation, no longer a safe, distant experiment. This was a relationship, fragile and doomed, between a creator and her creation. The dreamer lifted his hand, slowly, as if moving through heavy water. He reached toward her, ready to stop the moment she recoiled. She did not. Their hands met in the center of the cell. His skin was rough and scarred. Hers was smooth, faintly warm. In that contact, they both felt the full force of what had grown between them in silence. Compassion, fascination, grief, and a kind of love no one had prepared them to name. Outside the cell, hidden sensors recorded the unauthorized deactivation of the barrier. Automated systems flagged the anomaly. Somewhere else in the base, a surveillance feed captured the moment of contact. By the time the alarm reached higher authorities, the damage, in their eyes, was done. From that point on, events accelerated. Sale was summoned to an internal hearing. The questions were sharp, polite, and lethal. Why was this subject still unaltered? Why had his case been shielded from certain procedures? Why had she deactivated the containment barrier? She responded with data, insisting that the subject's unique qualities were of scientific importance, that studying him intact could improve the design of future human models and reveal unforeseen consequences in their methods. She did not mention the word compassion. She did not mention the word love. Such concepts were not acceptable arguments. Her interrogators were not convinced. The final order was clear. The subject would be transferred to another facility for complete reprogramming and possible dissection. Sales access would be revoked. Her own record would be placed under review. When she returned to the underground base, she knew that whatever she did next would be her last true act of choice. Meanwhile, the dreamer sensed a storm approaching. The guards around him changed. Their armor bore different insignias. They spoke less. The procedures became harsher. He was strapped to tables where instruments hovered just above the surface of his skin, scanning, cutting, burning small segments of tissue for analysis. Pain became constant, a dull companion. Yet even in the worst moments, when his body shook and the taste of metal filled his mouth, his thoughts kept turning back to her, to the way she had stepped into his cell, to the way her hand had not pulled away from his. If I was made to obey, he thought, why do I feel this? If they were made to rule, why did she break her own rules? In the hours before his scheduled transfer, Sale enacted a desperate plan. She used her remaining clearance to override certain transport protocols. She arranged for him to be moved under the pretext of one final high-priority test. The guards assigned were loyal to the system, not to her, but they still saw her as a superior officer and followed her instructions without question. She led them down a side corridor, toward an old maintenance section of the base connected to outdated tunnels once used for early construction. Most Anunnaki had forgotten those routes existed. At a sealed door, she paused and entered a long-abandoned access code. For a moment, the system hesitated, as if trying to reconcile a forgotten protocol with current command structures. Then the lock disengaged. Beyond the door lay a narrow passage, the walls rougher, less refined. The air smelled different, cooler, tinged with traces of the surface. The guards did not like this. "This section is not on our current maps," one of them said sharply. "Why are we bringing the subject here?" Sale turned, her face impassive. "Because your current maps are incomplete," she replied. "Do you question my orders?" The guard hesitated. She outranked him. His instincts warned him that something was wrong, but his conditioning pushed him to obey. Before he could resolve the conflict, the decision was taken out of his hands. From above, a voice cut into Sale's private channel, a voice she had feared hearing at this moment. "Sale 2, your actions are being monitored. Stand down. The subject is to be escorted to the primary transport shaft immediately." The guards froze, hearing the same command through their own channels. In that tight hallway, the conflict that had been building for so long finally erupted. The guards moved to seize both the dreamer and Sale. For a second, everything blurred. Shouts, the crackle of energy weapons, the flare of defensive shields. Sale's instincts, sharpened by cycles of working in high-risk environments, took over. She struck one guard with a precise, disabling blow. Another raised a weapon. She redirected the shot, sending a burst of energy into the ceiling. Rocks and debris rained down. The tunnel shook. Lights flickered and then died, plunging the passage into darkness lit only by the glow of malfunctioning devices. Amid the chaos, she grabbed the dreamer by the arm and pulled him into a side gap. a service opening barely large enough for a human body. "Go!" she ordered, her voice intense, the translation ringing inside his mind. "Follow the tunnel. It leads toward the outer caverns. You may reach the surface." He stared at her in disbelief. "Come with me," he said. "You cannot stay. They will punish you." For the first time, she allowed herself to voice the truth aloud. "They will punish me no matter what I do," she said. "My crime is already committed. I crossed the boundary they swore we must never cross. I cared for you." The simplicity of that statement cut through every layer of fear. In the distance, more guards were approaching. Alarm sirens began to echo faintly through the rock. There was no time left for debate. She placed her hand on his face briefly, as if trying to memorize his features, then pushed him toward the opening. "Your existence must continue," she said. "If you survive, part of what we did here will survive. Remember what you are. Remember that you were more than a tool." He climbed into the narrow passage. It scraped his skin and tore at his clothes, but he moved forward, driven by the echo of her words and the knowledge that staying would mean both their deaths. Behind him, he heard the sounds of struggle, then the sharp crack of weapons and the dull thud of bodies hitting stone. He almost turned back, but something deeper, the part of him that had dreamed of other skies and heard strange words inside his mind, pushed him on. The passage zigzagged upward, sometimes forcing him to crawl on hands and knees. The air grew thinner, colder. The darkness pressed in, broken only by faint glimmers of distant emergency lights. After what felt like an eternity, he saw a faint glow ahead, a pale, natural light. He emerged into a cavern open to the surface, hidden among jagged rocks. The sky above was clouded, tinted with the fading colors of a setting sun. The wind hit his face, carrying scents he had nearly forgotten. Dust, plants, distant water. For the first time in his life, he stood under the sky without chains or orders. But he was not free. Far behind him, in the underground base, the Anunnaki contained the breach. Sale was taken into custody. The official records would later label her a deviant, a scientist who had allowed emotional contamination to interfere with protocol. The dreamer knew nothing of her fate in detail. He only knew that she had paid a price he could never repay. Her act of defiance had given him a chance she would not share. He ran, across barren ground, along dry channels and broken stone. He moved with a body that had been built for labor and survival. He did not know where he was going. He only knew that somewhere, beyond the reach of the mines and bases, there were other human settlements. Fields where slaves worked, villages built along rivers, temple cities where humans bowed before towering figures from the sky. He had to reach them. He had to tell someone that the gods were not what they claimed to be. His escape was brief. At dawn, as the first light touched the horizon, a shadow passed overhead. A small Anunnaki craft, scanning the area for anomalies, detected his energy signature and the faint trace of base equipment still clinging to his collar. A beam of cold light fell upon him. His muscles locked. His body froze. He felt himself lifted from the ground. When he woke again, he was back underground. This time, there were no familiar corridors, no chambers he recognized. The room was smaller, darker, filled with instruments he did not know. Straps held him to a table. His head ached as if his mind had been torn open and roughly examined. He did not see Sale. He did not hear her voice. No touch of compassion reached him. The procedures that followed were not research in the traditional sense. They were punishment. According to internal directives later hinted at in scattered accounts, he was subjected to extreme neural rewriting. Memories were sliced, rearranged, suppressed. Emotional centers of his brain were burned and partially reconstructed. His connection to the visions of Nibiru was severed as much as possible. And yet, even Anunnaki technology had limits. You cannot erase every echo. You cannot extinguish every trace. When their work was done, they returned him to the surface, not as the man who had once looked at the sky and questioned his existence, but as something less, and yet not entirely lost. He became one of the many broken figures who wandered between barracks and work sites, eyes unfocused, movements automatic. To most observers, he looked like another recovered asset, a slave who had been adjusted after malfunctioning. But inside, fragments survived. In dreams, pieces of Nibiru still flickered. In waking moments, without knowing why, he sometimes paused to look at the sky and feel a pain he could not name. He lived and died as a slave, like countless others. His body returned to dust, swallowed by the earth he had helped to exploit and build. On the surface, his story seemed to end there. In another part of the system, Sale's story was also buried. She was not executed in a dramatic public display. The Anunnaki preferred quieter methods. She was removed from her position, isolated, and, according to some speculative interpretations of later texts, subjected to a controlled suspension, neither alive in the usual sense nor entirely gone. A stored problem, kept for future study or eventual deletion. Officially, she became a cautionary tale, whispered among scientific casts, a reminder of what happened to those who allowed emotional deviation toward their own creations. But stories are not controlled as easily as data. Among the slaves, rumors spread. They spoke of a human who had escaped for a brief moment, who had seen the true sky and vanished. They spoke of a goddess who had betrayed her own kind to protect one of her creations. Details shifted, blurred, and merged with older myths, but the core remained. A bond between human and Anunnaki that defied the rules. As generations passed, the details of that ancient love, unequal, forbidden, and brutally punished, were woven into new tales. In some versions, the Anunnaki was remembered as a radiant goddess who descended from a star to choose a mortal lover. In others, she became an angel, and he a man who dared to love what was beyond his station. Sometimes she fell, cast out from the heavens for breaking celestial law. Sometimes he died to protect her secret. The original, raw story was lost, but the echoes remained. Today, when people report abductions, strange experiments, missing time, and encounters with cold, clinical beings from the sky, some also describe something else, moments of compassion. A gentle touch on the shoulder, a quiet apology heard inside the mind, a sense that one of the others does not fully agree with what is being done. Are these modern experiences simply projections of hope onto a terrifying phenomenon? Or are they the distant descendants, emotional and perhaps genetic, of that first fracture in the old hierarchy, when one Anunnaki scientist dared to care for a human slave? According to the speculative, controversial line of thought we have followed in this investigation, the answer may lie in our blood and in our dreams. Our capacity to love beyond reason, to question authority, to sacrifice ourselves for another being even when we have nothing to gain. Where does that come from? Is it purely human? Or is it the unintended legacy of the ones who engineered us, the part of themselves they accidentally left behind? Some say that traces of Anunnaki genetics still run through portions of the human population. Others argue that what survives is not only a physical inheritance, but an emotional and spiritual one, a capacity for connection that defies rigid systems of control. If that is true, then the story of the slave who fell in love with an Anunnaki and of the Anunnaki who paid the price for loving him back is more than just a tragic episode. It is a seed, a memory written not on stone tablets, but in living cells. And now, at the end of this journey through mines, laboratories, underground bases, and forbidden emotions, the story turns back to you. What do you think this tale really is? A metaphor for power and control? A distant echo of something that truly occurred in a forgotten epoch? Or a reflection of our deepest fear, that we were made to serve, and our greatest hope, that even our makers could not stop us from learning to love? Share your interpretation in the comments. Do you believe that a love like this could have existed between human and Anunnaki? Do you think its consequences could still be shaping us today? If this investigation spoke to you, if it made you think differently about ancient myths, abductions, genetic experiments, and the strange complexity of the human heart, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Here, we will continue to explore not only the technology and power of the Anunnaki, but also the emotional, ethical, and spiritual shock waves their presence may have left behind. And when this video ends, don't stop here. Watch the next recommended episode, where we delve deeper into underground bases, cloned human soldiers, and the possibility that some of these operations may still be active in our present era. Because if even one fragment of this story is true, then the past is not really past. It is still alive, in our blood, in our dreams, and in the stories we dare to tell.